White store owner accuses black customer of theft. Later, he regrets it when the truth is exposed. Henry Walsh had always believed in the power of routine. It was the one thing he could rely on in a world that seemed increasingly unpredictable. His store, Walsh's Corner Market, had been a staple in the small town of Briarwood for over 4 decades, a place where customers knew exactly what to expect. The creaking of the door as it opened in the morning, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the back, and the familiar sound of the cash register ringing every time a customer made a purchase. These small, consistent details formed the fabric of Henry's life. His days, much like his store, followed a rhythm that had remained mostly unchanged for years. Before we can continue, if you love your family, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. Henry was the kind of person who found comfort in the mundane. He woke up at 5:30 every morning, long before the sun rose, and made himself a strong cup of black coffee. He read the local newspaper over breakfast, scanning for updates on the town's goings-on. Though not a man of many words, Henry prided himself on being an active observer of life, quietly watching from the periphery. The world outside his store had changed, but inside, things felt stable, predictable, safe. And in that predictability, he found his peace. Walsh's Corner Market was small by most standards, a modest building on the corner of Oak Street and Pine Avenue, tucked between a row of weathered houses. From the outside, the shop looked like something from another time. The faded red and white sign that hung above the door had been there since Henry's father had first opened the store. It was chipped and worn, but still visible, a reminder of the long history the Walsh family had in Briarwood. The large front windows, dusted with the remnants of decades-old advertisements, offered a view of the shelves inside, stocked neatly with canned goods, boxed cereals, fresh produce, and the occasional handwritten sign advertising the weekly sale. Henry had inherited the shop from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. The tradition of running the store had been passed down through 3 generations, each man pouring his energy and attention into maintaining the family business. It was a point of pride for Henry, one that defined him in many ways. He had never been a man of great ambition. There were no lofty dreams of expanding the store or franchising it into a chain. To Henry, that was the folly of people who didn't understand the value of simplicity. His purpose, his legacy, was tied to this one building, this one store. His father had taught him how to run it, and Henry in turn had taught his own son, who now worked as a cashier during weekends when he was home from college. The neighborhood, too, had changed over the years, though Henry had barely noticed it at first. When he was younger, the town of Briarwood had been predominantly white. People knew each other's names. There was a sense of camaraderie that flowed through the streets like an unspoken pact. Henry was known by nearly everyone, and people came to his store not just for the goods, but for the conversation. They might not always need anything, but they would stop in for a chat about the weather, the news, or the local gossip. The store became a gathering place, a familiar sanctuary amidst the unpredictability of life. But over time, Briarwood had slowly begun to change. The town was no longer as insular as it had once been. New families had moved in from nearby cities, bringing with them different cultures, customs, and expectations. The town was becoming more diverse, and though Henry had noticed the shift, he hadn't fully understood its implications. The new faces in town were not the same ones he had known growing up. They didn't share the same histories, the same sense of community. The change was subtle at first, but it was there, like a shadow creeping into the corner of his vision. In recent years, there had been an influx of black families moving into Briarwood, a trend that Henry couldn't ignore. His store, once a bastion of familiarity, now saw a mix of different people passing through its doors. Some of these new customers were regulars, but many were strangers, people Henry didn't recognize, people he hadn't seen before. It wasn't that he didn't welcome them. In fact, he tried to be polite and courteous. He would greet them when they came in, offer them assistance, and make small talk as he had always done with his old customers. But there was a quiet unease in him, a sense of discomfort he couldn't shake. He wasn't used to this new dynamic, this influx of people whose experiences, lives, and realities were different from his own. Most of the new faces were perfectly kind, and they seemed to appreciate the service Henry offered. Still, there was a part of him that didn't feel quite at ease. A part of him that, despite his best efforts, still viewed the change with suspicion. It wasn't that Henry saw these people as a threat, exactly. It was more like a vague sense of being out of his depth. He didn't know how to relate to them, how to interact with them the same way he did with the regular customers he had known for years. They were strangers in a town that had once felt like his own. It was late in the afternoon, the golden light of the setting sun spilling through the store's windows, when the unease reached its peak. Henry was standing behind the counter, wiping down the register, when he heard the bell above the door jingle, a sound that, in his mind, signaled the arrival of yet another customer. The man who walked in was tall and well-built, dressed in a plain black hoodie and carrying a backpack slung over one shoulder. His skin was dark, his face relaxed and neutral. Henry glanced up briefly, nodded in acknowledgement, and returned to his task. The man, who Henry would later come to know as Marcus, walked calmly through the aisles, scanning the shelves as though he had been here a dozen times before. He didn't rush or act suspicious. In fact, he seemed almost too calm, too methodical in his movements. Henry couldn't help but watch him from the corner of his eye, the faint stirrings of unease growing in the pit of his stomach. It wasn't anything overt, not at first. It wasn't like Marcus had done something obviously wrong. But there was something about the way he moved, the way his gaze lingered on certain items in the store, the watches, the higher-end products on display, that unsettled Henry. It wasn't a feeling he could fully articulate. It wasn't even conscious. It was just a gut reaction. Henry had always prided himself on his ability to read people. In his years of running the store, he had developed a keen sense for knowing when someone was simply browsing and when they were up to something. And something about Marcus felt off. Henry couldn't place it. He had seen other black customers before, but never one who made him feel quite like this. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. He chalked it up to the unfamiliarity of the moment. Perhaps it was just the change in the neighborhood, the new faces, that was getting to him. As he wiped down the counter again, Henry's mind raced through his usual mental checklist. Was Marcus taking too long to make a decision? Was he lingering around the expensive items? Henry had been burned before. A few months ago, a local teenager had tried to steal some electronics, and Henry had caught him in the act. It wasn't the first time someone had taken advantage of a small, quiet store. He was always vigilant, always on the lookout for anyone who might try to steal. But today felt different. The unease in Henry's gut began to transform into something more concrete, a tightness in his chest that demanded action. His gaze flicked back to Marcus, who was now standing in front of the display case, his fingers gently tapping the glass. The tapping was subtle, almost absent-minded, but it was enough to set off a chain of thoughts in Henry's mind. What if he's casing the joint? Henry thought to himself. What if he's just waiting for the right moment? It was a thought that sent a chill down his spine.
But why?
Why was it happening now? Why this man? Why him? Henry didn't know the answer. But the more he stared at Marcus, the more the discomfort grew, until it overshadowed everything else. His instincts screamed at him, pushing him to act. So, without thinking, Henry walked toward Marcus. As he approached, he took a deep breath and steeled himself for the confrontation he was sure was about to unfold. "Excuse me, sir," Henry said, his voice firm yet polite. "Can I help you with something?" Marcus turned slowly, his eyes meeting Henry's with a mixture of surprise and curiosity. The calmness in his expression didn't help Henry's anxiety. There was no guilt, no obvious sign of wrongdoing. Yet Henry's suspicion was unshakable. "Just looking around," Marcus replied, his tone neutral. He didn't seem particularly bothered by the interaction. He didn't seem suspicious or flustered. But for Henry, that was part of the problem. It didn't fit the narrative in his mind. The unease inside Henry intensified. "I noticed you were eyeing the watches earlier," Henry said, his voice slightly clipped. He wasn't sure where this conversation was going, but he felt a need to get control of the situation, to make sure everything was in order. He motioned toward the display case. "If you need help, I'm happy to assist." Marcus glanced at the display, but didn't respond immediately. For a moment, the tension between them hung in the air like a thick fog. Finally, Marcus replied, "I'm fine, really. Just looking." But Henry wasn't convinced. He stood there, waiting for the man to give him a reason to trust him. Every moment that passed seemed to stretch longer than it should, like a slow, inevitable descent into something uncomfortable. And then, in a decision that would change everything, Henry spoke the words that would escalate the situation beyond repair. The feeling Henry had when Marcus walked into the store was difficult to describe. There was nothing overtly threatening about the man. Marcus was calm, collected, his movements measured, purposeful. He wasn't in a rush, didn't seem to be scanning the shelves with the same frenzied energy that someone might display when they were preparing to make a quick grab and dash. In fact, he moved with the same care and intention that Henry would expect from a regular customer, someone who was familiar with the store's layout, who knew where everything was. Yet, something about the way Marcus stood in front of the display case, eyes lingering a little too long on the watches, unsettled Henry. Henry had never been the type to question his instincts. He had prided himself on his ability to read people, to gauge when something was amiss. Over the years, the small incidents of shoplifting that he had encountered in his store were always subtle at first, small things that weren't immediately noticed until after the fact. A missing item here, a misplaced product there, and Henry had developed a fine-tuned radar for such things. He knew how to pick up on the signs, the distracted glances, the nervous tics, the way people adjusted their posture when they thought no one was watching. Marcus, however, seemed different. His movements were calm, deliberate, nothing to suggest that he was up to anything unusual. But that made Henry's suspicion all the more unsettling. It was almost as though the man was trying to act too normal. It was this subtle tension that made Henry's discomfort swell into something more palpable, like a knot tightening in his chest. He couldn't explain it, couldn't put it into words, but the nagging feeling was there, something primal and unshakable. As Marcus continued to browse, Henry watched him from behind the counter, his eyes never leaving the man. He tried to distract himself with small tasks, wiping down shelves, organizing the gum section, but it was futile. The unease had already taken root, and it was growing with each passing minute. Henry couldn't focus on anything else. His eyes darted back to the security footage monitor in the corner of the room. The camera had a clear view of the entire shop, and Henry had developed the habit of keeping a close watch on it while he worked. It wasn't that he didn't trust his customers. It was just that the few incidents of theft that had occurred in the past had taught him to be vigilant. At first, Marcus was only visible on one screen, but soon, he appeared on several of them, moving through the aisles in full view of the cameras. Henry clicked through the various camera feeds, observing the man as he continued to pace slowly, taking his time. His gaze lingered on the more expensive items, as if he were weighing his options. It was this prolonged interest in the display case, the watches, the high-end electronics, that set Henry on edge. The store had always been a small, family-run business, with only a few luxury items that Henry had picked out himself, pieces that were meant to cater to the occasional customer who was willing to spend a little more. The watches were one of the more expensive items on display, something that Henry had always been proud of, despite their relatively small presence in the shop. But why would Marcus be so interested in them? They weren't exactly high-end, but they were pricey enough to raise eyebrows. Henry's mind, already conditioned to view every customer with some degree of suspicion, immediately began to make connections that were entirely unfounded, but that nonetheless seemed irrefutable to him in the moment. Had Marcus come in just to case the store? Was he plotting to steal one of the watches? Maybe it was just a coincidence, but the longer Marcus stood there, the more Henry's thoughts spiraled into paranoid overdrive. Perhaps he wasn't even aware of it, but the subconscious bias that had been quietly building for months began to take hold of his reasoning. Henry had grown up in Briarwood, and his community had always been small and homogeneous, with very few families of color. The new faces, the people from out of town, especially the black customers, felt unfamiliar, out of place. He would never have said it aloud, but there was a discomfort that lingered at the back of his mind whenever someone new came in, particularly when they didn't seem to be from the area. The more he watched Marcus on the screen, the more the feeling grew. His pulse quickened, his thoughts growing louder, until it became impossible for him to ignore the sensation that something wasn't right. And then, in a moment that felt almost instinctual, Henry made the decision to approach Marcus. He wiped his palms against his jeans and walked across the room. His heart thumped in his chest with a mixture of nervous energy and determination. He knew he was being vigilant. He knew it was his job to protect his business. But as he walked toward Marcus, something inside him whispered that he wasn't just looking out for the store anymore. Something deeper, more ingrained, was at play. "Excuse me, sir," Henry said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I noticed you were looking at the watches pretty closely. Can I help you with something?" His voice was sharp, more authoritative than he intended. But the words had already left his mouth, and he could hear the unmistakable tension in his own voice. He wasn't just being helpful. He was confronting the man with an accusation, albeit a subtle one. It wasn't that Henry was overtly accusing him of theft yet. It was more of a preemptive check, a way to reassert control over the situation. He needed to reassert control. Marcus turned toward him slowly, his face open but neutral. There was no sign of guilt, no nervous shifting or downcast eyes. Nothing that would suggest he was guilty of anything. In fact, he seemed almost puzzled by the sudden intrusion. "No, I'm just looking," Marcus replied calmly, his tone even. "I don't need any help." Henry stood there, frozen for a moment. Something about the man's calmness, the lack of defensiveness, only served to deepen the suspicion Henry felt. He had expected something more, a reaction of surprise, perhaps even irritation, but not the cool, disarming response Marcus had given him. It made Henry uneasy, as if he were the one who had lost control of the situation. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. People who were guilty, people who were doing something wrong, acted differently. They fidgeted, avoided eye contact, perhaps tried to brush him off. But Marcus did none of these things. Instead, he simply stood there, calm and collected. And that's when Henry's nerves began to fray. "I'm sorry, but I need to ask you to empty your pockets," Henry said, his voice a little more forceful this time. The words came out before he had fully processed them, and as soon as they left his lips, he realized how ridiculous they sounded. He had just met the man. There was no evidence. There was no reason to suspect him. And yet, the words hung in the air, heavy and final. Marcus raised an eyebrow, a slight tension visible in his jaw, but he didn't immediately respond. Henry's eyes locked onto the bulge in Marcus' jacket pocket. It was a small one, almost insignificant, but to Henry it was a red flag. He had seen this before, people trying to hide small items in their pockets, unaware that the smallest things could be enough to draw attention. But Marcus wasn't cooperating. He didn't immediately empty his pockets or comply with the request. Instead, he just looked at Henry, his gaze steady and unflinching. "I haven't stolen anything," Marcus replied, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not going to empty my pockets. You have no reason to ask me to do that." Henry's mind raced. He had seen enough shoplifters to recognize the subtle signs of someone trying to avoid detection, but Marcus didn't fit that profile. He wasn't behaving the way a thief would, at least not according to Henry's experience. Still, the discomfort nagged at him. Something wasn't right. He had to act. And so, Henry did what he had always done when faced with uncertainty. He doubled down. He didn't back off. He didn't give Marcus the benefit of the doubt. Instead, he allowed his instinct, the gut feeling he had ignored earlier, to drive the conversation forward. "I'm sorry, but I'm calling the police," Henry said, his voice tinged with finality. At that moment, Marcus' expression shifted. It was subtle, but it was there, a flicker of disbelief, of frustration. "You're calling the police over nothing?" Marcus asked, his voice steady, but tinged with incredulity. Henry stood firm, but the truth was, something in him was beginning to unravel. His decision to escalate the situation, to assume guilt, felt less like an act of vigilance and more like an act of pride. He was so sure of his rightness, so certain that his instincts had to be correct, that he failed to see how easily he had crossed a line. But the tension in the air was palpable. Marcus' calmness, his refusal to comply, had chipped away at the certainty Henry had once felt in his ability to control the situation. As Henry reached for the phone behind the counter, his mind churned. The decision had already been made, but a small part of him wondered if he had just made a terrible mistake. This expanded version of Section 2, the incident that shakes his belief, digs deeper into Henry's inner turmoil, his escalating anxiety, and the confrontational moment with Marcus. It explores the nuances of Henry's internal conflict, from his biases to the instinctual, almost reflexive actions he takes. The section is designed to build tension and lay the foundation for the unfolding sequences of Henry's decisions. Henry's hand trembled slightly as he reached for the phone behind the counter. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him, the gravity of the moment settling like a dense fog. In the span of a few minutes, everything had changed. What had started as a routine day in his small corner store had morphed into something far more fraught and dangerous. The store that had always been a refuge for him, a place of comfort, a space where everything had its place, now felt like a battleground. And the man standing before him, calm and unbothered, had become an adversary in a game Henry never intended to play. Marcus, who had been standing in front of the display case with his hands at his sides, watching Henry with an unreadable expression, now looked on with a mix of disbelief and confusion. There was no anger in his face, no sudden outburst of frustration. It was almost as if he couldn't fully grasp what was happening, as though the escalation of the situation seemed utterly foreign to him. Henry, however, was no longer focused on Marcus's expression. He had already made his decision. His instincts, those same instincts that had served him well throughout the years, had guided him to this point. His mind raced, torn between his need to be vigilant and the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. "I'm sorry, but I'm calling the police," Henry said again, his voice more authoritative now, though there was a faint quiver of doubt that he couldn't entirely conceal. He had to act. He had no choice. He had to protect his store. The customers that came in every day trusted him to keep the place safe, and he had always prided himself on being able to read people, to know when something was wrong. And yet, as his fingers hovered over the phone's buttons, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that this might be the wrong call, that the situation had already spiraled beyond his control. Marcus stood perfectly still, his gaze unwavering. He didn't move an inch, didn't flinch, didn't take a step back in the face of Henry's demand. His presence, his calmness, made the situation all the more unsettling. Henry had expected some sort of reaction, defensiveness, maybe an argument, something to validate his sense of suspicion. Instead, he found himself faced with a man who didn't seem rattled at all, who didn't seem to even understand why Henry was doing what he was doing. Marcus's silence hung in the air, heavy and tense. "You can't just accuse me like this," Marcus finally said, his voice calm but firm. There was no trace of panic in his tone, no hint of guilt. It was as if he were speaking to a person who had lost all sense of reason. "I haven't done anything wrong. Why are you doing this?" Henry's grip tightened around the phone, his mind racing. He had been certain, so certain, that Marcus was about to steal something. The way he'd lingered near the display case, the way his eyes had stayed fixed on the watches, it all seemed to fit a pattern Henry knew all too well. But now, faced with Marcus's calm demeanor, his refusal to react in the way Henry expected, he felt a creeping uncertainty that threatened to undo his confidence. "You are acting suspicious," Henry muttered, though the words felt hollow even as they left his mouth. "You were looking at the watches too long. I've seen it before. People do it all the time." Marcus tilted his head slightly, studying Henry with an intensity that made him feel exposed, as if Marcus could see through the veneer of authority Henry had tried to project. "People?
What do you mean by that?"
Marcus's voice was even, but there was an edge to it now. "What are you trying to say?" Henry felt a flash of irritation, a wave of defensiveness washing over him. "I don't have time for games. I'm calling the police." "If you didn't do anything wrong, then you have nothing to worry about," he said, the words coming out faster than he could catch them. He had said it to reassure himself as much as to reassure Marcus. The truth was, Henry's sense of control was slipping, and in that moment, he couldn't stand it. Marcus's brow furrowed, but his expression remained composed. "You're making a mistake," he said softly. His voice was almost a whisper now, as if he were speaking to someone who had lost their way. "You're accusing me of something I didn't do."
Why?
"Because I'm black? Is that what this is about?" The question hit Henry like a punch to the gut. It was as if the ground beneath him had given way, leaving him unmoored. Marcus's calm words were sharp, cutting through Henry's carefully constructed narrative. For a brief moment, Henry felt a pang of guilt, a flicker of doubt. He had been so certain of his own instincts, so sure that he was right, but now the walls he had built around his assumptions seemed to be crumbling. The question lingered in the air like a weight, forcing Henry to confront something deeper, something that had been gnawing at the back of his mind for days, maybe even years. Marcus didn't need to raise his voice, didn't need to make an accusation of his own. The simple question, the directness of it, had shaken Henry more than he cared to admit. He had never thought of himself as racist, never considered that his actions might be motivated by something as ugly as prejudice. But as he stood there, facing this man who had not shown a single sign of wrongdoing, Henry was forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that his suspicions had been shaped, perhaps unconsciously, by the very biases he had tried to deny. For the first time, Henry questioned the narrative he had been telling himself, the narrative that had justified his decision to escalate the situation, to call the police on a man who had done nothing more than look at a display case. His fingers hovered over the phone, but now they felt numb. The certainty he had once felt was gone, replaced by a gnawing unease. If he called the police now, what would that say about him? What would it say about the kind of man he was? "I don't know what you're talking about," Henry said, but the words felt inadequate, empty. He could hear the tremor in his own voice, the crack that betrayed the uncertainty he was now grappling with. He had been so sure of himself, so certain that he was doing the right thing, but now everything felt wrong. Marcus took a small step forward, and Henry instinctively took a step back. The distance between them felt like a chasm now. "I've been nothing but polite to you," Marcus said, his tone still level, though there was an undeniable weight to it now. "But you've made an assumption about me. And that assumption? It's based on nothing but the color of my skin. You think I'm here to steal something just because of how I look." Henry opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He had no defense, no excuse. He had been so certain that he was simply doing his job, so sure that his actions were justified by his experience. But now, as he looked into Marcus's eyes, the clarity of his own biases hit him like a cold slap. I don't know what to say," Henry finally stammered. The words were almost a whisper, as if he were trying to explain something to himself, not to Marcus. I just wanted to be sure." His voice trailed off, and he found himself staring at the phone in his hand, as if it had become an object far too heavy to lift. Marcus stood silently, his gaze unwavering. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the store's creaky floorboards beneath Henry's feet and the soft hum of the refrigerator in the back. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Finally, Marcus spoke again, but his tone was softer now, no longer accusatory. "You don't need to apologize to me," he said quietly. "But you do need to take a long look at yourself. What you're doing right now, that's not just about me. It's about how you see people who are different from you." Henry felt a lump rise in his throat, a sharp sting in his chest. The words hit harder than he could have anticipated. It wasn't just that he had made a mistake. It was that he had allowed his assumptions to shape his actions, to dictate how he treated someone based solely on their appearance. The realization was suffocating, and for a brief moment, Henry felt completely exposed. He felt small, insignificant, and utterly ashamed. Marcus took another step back, then turned toward the door. "I'm leaving now, but don't think for a second that I didn't see what just happened here." He paused with his hand on the door handle and turned back to Henry. "Maybe one day you'll realize that people aren't defined by the color of their skin. And when that happens, you might just see the world a little differently." With that, Marcus walked out of the store, leaving Henry standing in the middle of the room, the phone still in his hand, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The bell above the door jingled softly as the door closed behind him, but the silence that followed felt more deafening than any sound could be. For the first time in his life, Henry wasn't sure what to believe anymore. The bell above the door jingled softly as Marcus stepped outside, the sound reverberating in Henry's mind long after the man had disappeared into the street. The moment hung heavy in the air, an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow everything around him. Henry stood frozen behind the counter, his fingers still wrapped tightly around the phone, but he no longer had any desire to make the call. The words Marcus had spoken echoed in his ears, a slow, insistent drumbeat that drowned out everything else. Maybe one day you'll realize that people aren't defined by the color of their skin. It was like a punch to the gut, a revelation that cut through the layers of denial he had built up over the years. It wasn't that Henry had never questioned his own beliefs before. He had. But those questions had always been theoretical, abstract. They hadn't been rooted in real-world experiences, in tangible consequences. But Marcus's words? They made the abstract personal. They forced Henry to face something he had spent a lifetime avoiding, the truth about the assumptions he had made, not just about Marcus, but about everyone who didn't look like him. Henry's mind raced, replaying the events of the past few minutes over and over again. He tried to rationalize his actions, to find a way to justify them. But the harder he thought, the more the contradictions began to surface. He had acted out of instinct, he told himself. That was all it had been, gut feeling, years of experience, an intuitive sense that something wasn't right. He had seen people behave suspiciously before. He had seen the signs, the way they looked around furtively, the way they lingered near the more expensive items, their nervous fidgeting. But Marcus hadn't done any of those things. In fact, he had been the opposite, calm, composed, measured. He hadn't given Henry a single reason to doubt him, not in any tangible way. And yet Henry had acted.
Why?
Why had he jumped to the conclusion that Marcus was a thief? The more he asked himself that question, the more uncomfortable the answer became. The truth, however hard it was to admit, was staring him in the face. He had assumed Marcus was guilty, not because of anything Marcus had done, but because of who Marcus was. The color of his skin. The realization struck Henry like a wave, a cold, unrelenting tide that seemed to rise higher with each passing moment. He could feel it creeping into every corner of his mind, challenging every assumption he had ever held, every instinct he had ever trusted. He had been so sure of himself, so certain that he was protecting his store, doing the right thing. But now he saw that what he had been protecting wasn't the store. It was a version of the world in which people like Marcus were always the other, always the outsider, always a potential threat. Henry leaned against the counter, his hand still gripping the phone as if it were a lifeline, something solid to hold on to in the midst of a storm. But now it felt alien in his hand, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. His chest tightened, his breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps. He hadn't just made a mistake with Marcus. He had made a mistake with himself. His entire worldview, the way he had interpreted every interaction, every person who walked through his door, had been filtered through a lens of bias that he had never bothered to examine. The irony of it all gnawed at him. He had spent years telling himself that he wasn't like the people who made snap judgments based on race or appearance. He had prided himself on being fair, on treating everyone equally. But now, faced with the undeniable truth of his actions, he saw how deeply ingrained his biases were. They had shaped him, molded him into someone he didn't recognize. He wasn't just the victim of his own assumptions. He had been complicit in them, reinforcing them in small, everyday ways that he had never questioned. The store, once a place of refuge, felt suffocating now. The shelves seemed to close in around him, the familiar objects that had once comforted him now symbols of his failure. The watches he had so carefully arranged, the neatly stacked rows of merchandise, each item now felt like an accusation. How many times had he stood behind that counter, scanning the room for signs of trouble, only to overlook the trouble that lay within him? Henry wiped a hand across his face, trying to clear his thoughts, but it was no use. The weight of Marcus's words, of the situation that had unfolded, pressed on him like a physical burden. He had seen himself as the protagonist in this story, the one in control, the one who knew how to handle the unexpected. But now, for the first time, he saw that the story wasn't about him at all. It was about how he had let his biases shape his world, how he had allowed fear and suspicion to dictate his actions. He closed his eyes, willing himself to focus, to sort through the mess in his mind. He tried to picture the moment when he had first noticed Marcus, standing in front of a display case. The way the man had seemed too still, too composed. The way his gaze lingered just a little longer than expected. But now, in the cold light of hindsight, Henry realized that there was nothing unusual about it. It was just a man looking at watches, just another customer browsing. The only thing that had been different was Henry's reaction. He had seen what he wanted to see, not what was actually there. The more Henry thought about it, the more the situation felt like a nightmare. He had called the police. He had made an accusation against a man who had done nothing but stand there, who had treated him with nothing but politeness and calm. He had called the police on Marcus because he had assumed, based on nothing more than his appearance, that he was a thief. The shame of it was almost too much to bear. How could he have been so blind? How could he have allowed himself to be so ignorant, so willfully unexamining of the prejudice that lay just beneath the surface of his actions? His mind wandered to the conversations he had heard in the past, the whispers of crime in his neighborhood, the occasional comment about people who didn't belong in Briarwood. He had always dismissed those comments, convinced that they were the product of narrow-minded thinking, of people who were too afraid to change with the times. But now he realized that he had been complicit in that thinking. He had internalized it without even realizing it. He had assumed, without question, that a black man in his store was up to no good. And that, perhaps more than anything else, was the part that stung the most. Henry's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps outside. He didn't need to look up to know it was Marcus. The man had returned. Henry's heart skipped a beat. His first instinct was to hide, to retreat into the safety of his isolation, to pretend that everything was fine. But something inside him told him that he couldn't do that, not this time. Not after everything that had happened. He stood up, his legs unsteady as if they were no longer fully under his control. His mind was spinning, his heart pounding in his chest. When Marcus walked back through the door, he wasn't sure what to expect. He didn't know if the man would be angry, if he would demand an apology or accuse Henry of further wrongs. But when Marcus stepped inside, his expression was calm. The tension from earlier seemed to have dissolved, replaced by a quiet resolve. Henry opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. What could he say? What could he possibly say that would make up for what had happened? The damage was done. "I came back," Marcus said, his voice steady, "because I think you need to hear something." Henry nodded silently, his gaze fixed on the floor. He had no words, no defense, only the crushing weight of his own guilt. Marcus stepped closer, his presence not threatening but authoritative, like a man who had seen the world for what it was and understood the ugliness in it. "You don't need to apologize to me," he said, his voice low but clear. "What you need to do is ask yourself why you thought I was a thief in the first place. Why you thought it was okay to treat me like that. You don't need to explain it to me, Henry. You need to explain it to yourself." Henry didn't respond. He couldn't. He was paralyzed by the truth, by the realization that Marcus was right. There was no easy way out of this. The consequences of his actions weren't something he could undo with an apology. They were something he would have to live with. Marcus took a step back, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything. Henry stood there, 1,000 thoughts running through his head, but none of them felt right. None of them could undo the damage. "You'll figure it out," Marcus said, his tone softer now, almost as if he were speaking to a man who had just woken up from a long, uncomfortable sleep. "But you need to start by being honest with yourself. You need to understand that people aren't their appearances, and they're certainly not the assumptions we make about them. Not now, not ever." With that, Marcus turned and walked back out the door. Henry stood in silence, the weight of his words sinking in, the truth settling over him like a heavy blanket. The store felt quieter now, as if the world itself were holding its breath. The work ahead of him would be long, painful, and deeply uncomfortable. But for the first time in years, Henry understood what true change might look like. And it started with him. This expanded version of Section 4, Struggling with the Truth, gives us a detailed look into Henry's growing awareness of his biases, his internal struggle with guilt, and his efforts to process the confrontation with Marcus. This section shows Henry wrestling with the painful truth of his actions, setting the stage for the personal growth that will come in later sections. The days following Marcus's visit felt strangely disorienting to Henry. It was as if the world had shifted in ways he couldn't fully comprehend, leaving him unmoored and uncertain. He had expected the experience to be one of clarity, of resolution, but instead, he found himself at a crossroads, questioning everything he thought he knew about himself. He wanted to believe that his actions had been justified, that Marcus's presence in the store had triggered a natural response, one born out of concern for his business. But no matter how many times he retraced his steps, Henry couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something much darker had been at play. Still, the days wore on, and life in the store began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The shelves remained stocked, the cash register continued to ring, and customers came and went with little fanfare. But Henry wasn't the same. He carried the weight of Marcus's departure with him everywhere he went, even as he tried to move past it, to bury the truth beneath layers of routine. He found himself thinking about that conversation more than he cared to admit, even though he told himself that he'd made the right call. He'd done what needed to be done. The store was quiet on the Thursday afternoon when Detective Matthews walked in. Henry hadn't expected to see him, especially not so soon after the incident. But there he was, standing in the doorway, his familiar uniform making Henry feel an odd sense of both relief and unease. The detective had been the one to arrive when the police were called. He had listened to Henry's side of the story, taken the details of the situation down, and left with a few words of caution. "Mr. Howard," Matthews said, his voice steady as he approached the counter. "How are you doing today?" Henry nodded, forcing a smile. "Doing well, Detective. Everything's fine here." The words felt mechanical, like they were coming from someone who didn't fully believe them. He couldn't shake the feeling that Matthews was there for a reason, that the detective had questions that were waiting to be asked. Matthews' gaze flicked over the store, taking in the familiar shelves and displays, before settling back on Henry. "I wanted to follow up on that call you made the other day. About the theft, I mean. I appreciate you reaching out when you had concerns." Henry tensed at the mention of the call. It was the kind of moment that he had been preparing for, the one where everything would either be validated or exposed. He had hoped it wouldn't come to this, to being questioned or having his actions scrutinized by someone like Matthews. But here it was. His pulse quickened. "Of course," Henry replied, his voice just a bit too high-pitched. "I'm just doing what I thought was right. I saw something that made me concerned, and I acted." He paused, hoping that his explanation would suffice, that Matthews would leave it at that. But the detective didn't seem satisfied. "You were sure about it then?" Matthews asked, his tone probing, but not confrontational. "You were sure he was stealing?" Henry felt the weight of the question settle on his chest. Was he sure? The uncertainty that had plagued him in the days since Marcus's departure began to resurface. He had been certain that Marcus was a threat, that something was off about the way the man had lingered in the store. But now, in the cold light of the present, the certainty seemed like a distant memory. He had acted based on instinct, on assumptions that he had only just begun to understand were deeply flawed. I was certain," Henry said, though the words felt hollow. "He was hanging around the watches, eyeing them a little too long, you know? I've seen it before. People act suspicious, and you can just tell." Matthews nodded, as though he understood. "Right, I get it. You've been in this business long enough to know when something doesn't feel right." Henry exhaled, relieved that Matthews hadn't pressed him further. He thought the detective might leave it at that. But instead, Matthews continued, his voice shifting ever so slightly. "Here's the thing, Henry," Matthews said, leaning in a bit closer. "I followed up on the man you mentioned, the one who you said was acting suspicious. His name's Marcus Williams. And I gotta tell you, there's no record of him. Nothing. No arrests, no charges. He's clean. And there was no evidence of any theft in your store either. Not a single thing missing. Henry's heart skipped a beat, a cold sweat breaking out across his forehead. What was Matthews saying? Now, I'm not suggesting anything, Matthews said, his voice becoming more measured. But I just wanted to make sure you were aware. This isn't the first time I've had to look into a situation like this, one where a shopkeeper feels threatened by someone based on a hunch. It's a tough position to be in, no doubt about it. But I think it's something you might want to think about. The words hit Henry with a force he hadn't anticipated. He tried to remain composed, but the flood of emotions, embarrassment, guilt, shame, rushed in like a tidal wave. He had done what he thought was right. He had acted to protect his store, to preserve his business. But now, in the face of Matthew's words, he realized the truth. His actions had been guided not by a desire to protect his store, but by something far less noble. His own biases had led him to this moment. He had made a judgment not based on reason, but on something darker. Right, Henry said, clearing his throat. I see what you're saying. His voice felt thick with the weight of everything he hadn't said, everything he had been avoiding. He wanted to explain himself, to justify his actions, but the words stuck in his throat. Matthews gave him a sympathetic look. I'm not here to make you feel bad, Henry. We all make mistakes. But sometimes, it's about what happens after the mistake, what we learn from it. Henry nodded, but it felt like a hollow gesture, a way to fill the silence that had grown between them. He had wanted validation. He had hoped that his actions would be understood, even justified. But now, faced with the full implications of what he had done, he realized that the validation he sought was a false one. There was no victory to be had here, only the slow, painful unraveling of everything he thought he knew about himself. Matthews gave him a final look before turning to leave. Take care of yourself, Henry. Think about what I said. As the door closed behind him, Henry was left standing there, the weight of the detective's words hanging in the air. For the first time in his life, he felt the full weight of his own ignorance, the full weight of his actions. He had made a decision, and now he was living with the consequences of it. In the days that followed, Henry's interactions with his customers became strained. He couldn't shake the image of Marcus's face from his mind, the calm, almost serene expression as the man had confronted him. Every time a customer walked into the store, Henry found himself looking at them with a new awareness, a wariness he hadn't had before. He could feel the old instincts, those snap judgments, rising to the surface, but now they felt alien to him. He wasn't sure what to trust anymore. On one particularly slow afternoon, a regular customer, Mrs. Patterson, came in to pick up a prescription. She was a kind woman, older, with a warm smile and a habit of chatting about her grandchildren. Henry greeted her with his usual pleasantries, but today, something felt off. He couldn't help but wonder what she was thinking about him. Was she silently judging him? Too? Was she wondering why he had acted the way he had? Everything all right, Henry? Mrs. Patterson asked as she placed her items on the counter. Yeah, Henry said, forcing a smile. Just, been a little off lately. Mrs. Patterson looked at him with concern. Well, don't let it get to you, dear. You're a good man. I've known you for years. People can be strange sometimes, but don't let them make you second-guess yourself. Her words, meant to be reassuring, only deepened Henry's sense of isolation. He had always prided himself on being a good man. But now, he couldn't help but question that very label. Had he ever truly been a good man? Or had he simply been a man who had never been forced to confront the ugliness lurking beneath the surface of his own assumptions? As Mrs. Patterson left the store, Henry watched her go, the door closing softly behind her. And for the first time, he realized that what he had wanted, what he had thought was a victory, was nothing more than an illusion. What he had wanted was the reassurance that he was right, that his instincts had been sound. But what he had gotten instead was a truth he hadn't been ready to face. There was no easy way out of this. The damage was done. The only thing Henry could do now was figure out how to move forward. This expanded version of Section 5 Getting what he wanted delves into Henry's internal conflict as he grapples with the false victory he thought he had achieved. He begins to realize the weight of his actions and the emptiness of the validation he sought. This section sets the stage for the eventual reckoning that will occur as Henry fully confronts his biases and seeks redemption. The following week after Matthews's visit felt like a slow unraveling for Henry. The weight of his actions pressed down on him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The days were quieter, not because fewer customers were coming into the store, but because the silence seemed louder now. Every time the door chimed, announcing the arrival of a new customer, Henry's heart would tighten in his chest. Would they see him differently? Would they know what he had done? Could they sense that he had wronged someone, that he had allowed himself to be governed by assumptions rather than facts? The unsettling truth gnawed at him as he tried to push it away. But it didn't work. It followed him like a shadow. The guilt hung heavy, and no amount of work, no amount of busying himself with restocking shelves or adjusting the display cases, could distract him. There were no more false victories, no more comforting justifications. The reality of what he had done was beginning to seep in, layer by layer, until it felt as though it was suffocating him. It wasn't just the guilt that tormented him, it was the anger, his anger at himself. How could he have been so blind? He had thought he was simply protecting his store, doing what was right. But the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. His actions had been rooted in fear, in ingrained biases, in the kind of thinking that allowed him to see people as threats before they even had a chance to prove themselves. He had judged Marcus based on nothing more than how he looked, how he behaved, how he didn't fit into the neat little categories Henry had made for the world. It was so easy to demonize someone when you had no intention of seeing them as fully human. But even with all this clarity, Henry found himself paralyzed. What could he do now? What could he say to make up for what he had done? He couldn't undo the phone call to the police. He couldn't unring the bell that had signaled Marcus's departure, the door clicking shut behind him, taking any chance of reconciliation with it. All Henry had now were the consequences of his actions. A man's reputation tarnished by his unwarranted suspicion, his own conscience rattling louder with each passing day. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon when a small package arrived for Henry, addressed in neat, black handwriting. The envelope was thin but firm, and it bore no return address. At first, he didn't know what to make of it. He hadn't ordered anything recently. He didn't recognize the handwriting. Curiosity gnawed at him as he held the package in his hands. He opened it slowly, afraid of what he might find inside, but what he saw only deepened the ache that had taken root in his chest. Inside was a photograph. A photo of Marcus. It was a picture of Marcus standing in front of the store, a slight frown on his face, his arms crossed. But that wasn't what caught Henry's attention. What caught his attention was the other photo tucked behind it, a newspaper clipping. It was a small, dated article about a community fundraiser for a local children's hospital. The headline read, "Local man gives generously to Children's Hospital Fund." Below the headline was a picture of Marcus Williams, the same man Henry had seen in his store. The article praised him for his charitable donations, his work with at-risk youth, and his commitment to helping those in need. Henry's breath caught in his throat. He felt a lump form in his chest. This wasn't the person he had imagined. This wasn't the man who had come into his store with a suspicious look on his face. This wasn't the potential criminal he had called the police on. This was someone entirely different. This was someone with a history of kindness, of giving, someone who had been working to improve his community. Henry felt sick. What had he done? He had reduced Marcus to a stereotype, a criminal in his mind, without ever giving him the benefit of the doubt, without ever allowing him to be a person. Instead, he had seen him as a threat, a figure of suspicion. Henry had allowed the things he was afraid of, the narratives he had been taught, the biases that lay dormant inside him, to dictate his actions. There was no justification for what he had done. No way to spin it into something that didn't make him feel like a failure. This wasn't about a misunderstanding. This wasn't about simply making a mistake. Henry had wronged someone in the worst possible way, by making a snap judgment based on nothing more than appearances. And now, Marcus was gone. But the real sting came when Henry looked at the bottom of the clipping, where there was a line in smaller print. It said, "Marcus Williams, currently recovering from a recent injury, is taking a break from public appearances." Henry's stomach dropped. His eyes began to well with tears. He had called the police on a man who, at that very moment, had been recovering from an injury, possibly one that had left him vulnerable in ways Henry could never have known. The shame consumed him. He had thought of himself as a reasonable person, someone who could keep a level head, who could assess situations with fairness. But he hadn't. He had failed Marcus in a way that was impossible to undo. And that was the hardest part of all. There was no fixing it. Henry placed the photograph and the clipping on the counter and stood there, staring at them, his hand trembling. He felt as if he had been gut-punched. His thoughts swirled with the enormity of what he had done. The weight of his own racism, his fear, his impulse to protect his business at all costs, everything he had allowed to cloud his judgment was now laid bare in front of him. There was no excuse for it. He had been wrong, and that was the painful truth he had to live with. That night, Henry barely slept. He kept replaying the scene over and over in his head. The way Marcus had looked at him, the way he had held his composure, even when confronted with an accusation that no one should have to face. Henry's mind kept returning to the words Marcus had said, though they had been quiet and measured at the time. "You don't know me." No, Henry didn't know him. He didn't know anything about Marcus. All he had known was what he had assumed, what he had feared, and he had let that dictate his actions. The next morning, Henry knew what he had to do, but he didn't know if it was even possible. He called the phone number he had gotten from the police report, the number for Marcus Williams, the one he had hesitated to call before, when the weight of his assumptions had still been a shield around his conscience. He dialed, and it rang for what seemed like an eternity. Finally, a voice on the other end, a calm, even voice that still held a note of wariness. "Hello." Henry swallowed. It was him. It was Marcus. "Mr. Williams," Henry said, his voice cracking. "This is Henry Howard, the owner of the jewelry store. I need to apologize. I don't know how else to say this. I wronged you. I made a terrible mistake, and I need to own it. I judged you without knowing anything about you. And I just want to say, I am so sorry." There was a long pause. Henry's heart raced. He wasn't sure if Marcus would hang up, if he would yell at him, or if he would even believe that the apology was sincere. But when Marcus finally spoke, his tone was quiet, almost resigned. "I don't know what you expected me to say," Marcus said. "But thank you, I guess. You're right. You don't know me. But you're not the first person to think the worst of me. That's the reality I live with. Every day." Henry felt the sting of those words. He wasn't the first. He was just another in a long line of people who had judged Marcus for who he was on the outside, not the person he truly was on the inside. It hit Henry hard. He had thought he was protecting his store, protecting his livelihood, but in doing so, he had inadvertently harmed a man who had done nothing wrong. The conversation was brief. There was no grand reconciliation, no forgiveness immediately given. But Henry understood something in that moment. The price of his actions wasn't something that could be settled with a simple apology or an explanation. The real cost was the lost trust, the damage done to a person's reputation, and the way his own biases had defined an entire interaction. He had paid a heavy price. And though it was painful, it was a price he would continue to pay for as long as he carried the burden of his mistake. The morning light streamed through the window of the jewelry store, casting long shadows across the polished countertops and gleaming displays. Henry stood behind the counter, his hands resting lightly on the surface, his mind elsewhere. It was the same store, the same familiar surroundings, but it felt different now. The space, which once felt like a safe haven, now seemed like a reminder of everything that had gone wrong. Every tick of the clock, every customer who entered, carried with it the weight of the lessons he had learned, and the burden of the mistakes he had made. The store had always been a place of comfort for Henry. For years, it had been his world, his domain, and he had taken pride in being its steward. But now, with the sting of his actions still fresh, it felt like a prison. He had never imagined that something as simple as a routine visit to his store could change his life so completely. He had thought of himself as someone who had it all figured out, someone who had a strong sense of right and wrong, who could make decisions with confidence. But that confidence had been shattered, and now every customer who walked through the door reminded him of his own fallibility. Henry had spent the past few days wrestling with his conscience, replaying his actions over and over in his mind, asking himself where he had gone wrong. The apology he had made to Marcus had been a small step, but it had hardly begun to undo the damage he had caused. In truth, he didn't know if it ever could. There were no guarantees in life, no simple ways to make things right once the damage had been done. But in that moment, as he stood behind the counter, Henry realized something. This wasn't about erasing the past. It wasn't about going back to the way things were before. It was about moving forward, learning from his mistakes, changing the way he saw the world, and becoming a better person in the process. He had always been someone who valued control, who saw life as something that could be managed and contained. But the events of the past weeks had shaken that belief. Life, he now understood, wasn't something that could be neatly organized or neatly explained. It was messy, unpredictable, and often painful. And it was precisely in the messiness of life that Henry had learned his most important lesson. That change, real, meaningful change, didn't come from simply getting things right. It came from recognizing when you were wrong, confronting your own flaws, and doing the difficult work of becoming a better person. As the door chimed and the first customer of the day entered, Henry straightened up and forced a smile. He greeted the woman with the same polite enthusiasm he had always used, but this time, it felt different. It wasn't just about making a sale or going through the motions. For the first time in a long while, Henry found himself actually paying attention to the people who walked into his store. He wasn't just ING them for potential threats or opportunities. He was looking at them as individuals, trying to understand who they were, what they needed, and how he could help. It was a small change, but it was significant. For Henry, it was the first step toward redemption. He wasn't going to be perfect. He wasn't going to erase the mistakes of the past. But he could try. He could make an effort to be better, to see people with more compassion, to approach life with a sense of humility and openness. And as the woman picked out a necklace and made her way to the counter, Henry found himself genuinely interested in her. He asked her about her day, about her family, and listened carefully to her answers. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next few weeks, Henry began to notice the small ways his perspective was changing. He wasn't so quick to judge. He found himself holding back his assumptions, pausing before acting on instinct, and trying to see things from a different angle. It wasn't easy. Old habits died hard. The part of him that had once been so quick to categorize people and situations was still there, lurking beneath the surface. But now, when that instinct began to rise, Henry forced himself to question it. Why did I think that? What assumptions am I making? Is this truly how I see this person? Or am I projecting something onto them based on my own fears and prejudices? It wasn't always successful. There were moments when his old biases resurfaced, when the familiar patterns of judgment crept into his thinking. But he caught himself, and that was the key. The first step toward change wasn't perfection. It was awareness. And slowly but surely, Henry became more aware of his thoughts, his actions, and the ways in which his own biases had shaped the way he interacted with others. One afternoon, as Henry was organizing a display case, a familiar face appeared in the doorway of the store. It was Marcus. For a moment, Henry froze. He wasn't sure what to do. He had imagined this moment in his mind, but now that it was happening, he didn't know how to approach it. What could he say? How could he make things right after everything he had done? Marcus stepped inside and paused at the door, his eyes scanning the store before landing on Henry. For a second, there was a long silence. Henry's heart beat loudly in his chest as he waited for Marcus to speak. But to his surprise, Marcus simply walked up to the counter. "Hello, Mr. Howard," Marcus said, his tone polite but cautious. "Marcus," Henry replied, his voice thick with emotion. I didn't expect you." Marcus smiled, but it was a restrained smile, the kind that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I figured I should stop by and see how you're doing." I've been meaning to come in for a while now. Henry nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. This was the moment. This was the conversation he had been dreading, but now that it was here, he realized something important. He didn't have to fix everything right now. What mattered wasn't saying the perfect thing. What mattered was acknowledging the truth, owning his mistake, and taking responsibility for it. I owe you a huge apology, Henry said, his voice breaking. I don't know if I can ever make up for what I did, but I want you to know how deeply sorry I am. I judged you without knowing you. I made assumptions and I hurt you. I'll never forgive myself for that. Marcus regarded him silently for a moment, his expression unreadable. Henry held his breath, waiting for the inevitable rejection, the anger, or the dismissal that he feared. But then Marcus spoke. You're not the first person to make assumptions about me, Mr. Howard, he said quietly. And I get it. People do that all the time. But I appreciate that you're owning up to it. That means something. Henry felt a wave of relief wash over him, though it didn't erase the guilt. It wasn't over, but it was a start. I want to do better, Henry said, his voice steadying. I don't know how to fix everything, but I want to try. I want to be better, and I'll keep trying every day. Marcus nodded slowly. That's all anyone can do. No one's perfect, but the fact that you're trying, that means something. The conversation was brief, but for Henry, it was a moment of grace. He realized that redemption wasn't a single event, nor was it something that could be handed out like a gift. Redemption was something earned, something fought for, day by day, decision by decision. And although he still had a long way to go, Henry knew that he was on the right path. As Marcus left the store, Henry stood there, his mind quiet for the first time in weeks. The store felt different now, not as a place of isolation, but as a space where he could grow, where he could learn, and where he could make amends for the mistakes of his past. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't easy, but it was real. And that, he thought, was enough for today. Henry took a deep breath and looked around the store once more. The familiar surroundings hadn't changed, but he had. And that, in the end, was the most important thing of all.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.